The wrench hit the concrete floor with a sound like a gunshot, and every head on the assembly line turned toward the sound. Marcus Webb did not raise his voice. He did not clench his fists. He simply looked at the woman standing in front of him in her tailored blazer and her clean, unscuffed shoes, and he let the silence answer for him. "Know your place, Marcus," she had just said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "You fix machines. You don't run this company." He bent down, picked the wrench back up, and set it gently into the felt-lined slot of his toolbox where it belonged. Then he closed the lid. The latch clicked twice, the way it always did, the way it had, for 11 years. He did not argue. He did not explain. He picked up the toolbox and walked toward the exit doors at the far end of the plant, past 600 feet of silent machinery and stunned faces, and nobody in that building understood yet what they had just watched happen. If you've ever worked somewhere that only noticed you when something broke, if you've ever been the person everyone quietly depended on and nobody publicly thanked, you are going to want to see where this one goes. Stay with this until the end, because in 11 days that woman would be standing on this same floor in front of the whole plant, apologizing to him with a shaking voice, and she wouldn't have a choice. 10 weeks earlier, the Callahan manufacturing plant in Terre Haute, Indiana was running the way it had run for the better part of 2 decades. Loud, hot, and dependent on one man nobody outside the building had ever heard of. Marcus Webb was 44 years old, and he had been the senior maintenance technician at Callahan since before his daughter was born. He was not an engineer by degree. He had no diploma hanging on a wall. What he had was 14,000 hours of listening to machines and an ear that could tell you a bearing was failing 3 days before it actually would. His mornings started at 5. He made 2 lunches, one for himself and one for Emma, who was 8 years old and missing her 2 front teeth, and who insisted on inspecting his lunch the same way he inspected his machines, checking that he had packed the apple slices and not just the sandwich. "You always forget the apple slices." "Dad, I have never once forgotten the apple slices." "You forgot them on Tuesday." He had not, in fact, forgotten them on Tuesday. But he let her win the argument because some arguments were not worth the ground they were fought over, and his daughter's small victories mattered more to him than being right. His wife had died 4 years earlier, cancer, fast and cruel, and in the time since his house had become a study in quiet order. Tools hung on pegboards with their outlines traced in marker. Shoes lined up by the door. A calendar on the refrigerator with Emma's soccer practices written in blue and his work shifts written in black. And no square on that calendar was ever a surprise to either of them. At the plant, the machines did not care about any of that. They only cared whether Marcus showed up. The Callahan plant made precision components for aerospace and industrial clients. Tolerances measured in 1/1000th of an inch. Contracts worth tens of millions of dollars, riding on machines that were in places older than some of the engineers who supervised them. Those engineers had degrees. Marcus had instinct built on a foundation of actual hands-on repetition that no classroom could replicate. When a CNC machine started producing parts a hair's width out of spec, the engineers ran diagnostics for 2 days. Marcus walked over, put his hand flat against the housing, felt the vibration pattern, and told them it was a worn spindle bearing before their diagnostic software had even finished its second pass. He had done this so many times that it had become invisible. Nobody remarks on the fact that the sun rises. It had simply become a fact of life at Callahan. Something breaks. Somebody finds Marcus. That invisibility was about to become a problem, because the company had just hired a new CEO, and she did not know the sun rose at all. Vanessa Cole came into Callahan, manufacturing from a private equity firm in Chicago, and she came in with the specific mandate of preparing the company for acquisition. Her job, as she saw it, was margins, efficiency, optics for a due diligence team that would be walking through these doors in a matter of months. She was 38, sharp in the way that a knife is sharp, meaning useful for cutting and dangerous for holding. She had never worked a manufacturing floor a day in her life. Her previous roles had been in finance and restructuring, and she talked about the plant the way someone talks about a spreadsheet they haven't opened yet. In her first all-staff meeting, she stood in front of 600 employees and told them that Callahan was going to become lean, modern, and investor-ready. She used the word legacy 3 times, and each time she said it like it was something to be embarrassed about. She had brought her own people. A director of operations named Trent Buford, who had worked with her at 2 previous companies and who understood precisely what she wanted before she finished asking for it. Trent's specialty, if you could call it that, was making problems disappear from reports without making them disappear from reality. It was Trent who first suggested cutting the maintenance budget by 30%. The machines have been running fine, he told Vanessa, in a conference room with a view of the parking lot instead of the factory floor. We've got redundant coverage in maintenance. 1 guy's doing the work of 3, which means we're paying for 2 guys we don't need. What Trent did not say, because he did not fully understand it, was that the redundant coverage was mostly theoretical. The other 2 technicians on paper handled routine lubrication schedules and basic part swaps. Marcus handled everything that actually threatened to stop production. Vanessa approved the cut without walking the floor first. It took 11 days for the first machine to go down hard. It was a 5-axis mill, the newest and most expensive piece of equipment in the building, responsible for a component going into a defense contract that made up 18% of Callahan's annual revenue. It threw an error code at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, and the 2 remaining technicians stood in front of it for 40 minutes without understanding what they were looking at. Marcus was called in from a different section of the plant. He listened to the machine for maybe 90 seconds, not looking at the error code, just listening, then opened a service panel and pointed to a coolant line that had begun to crack from age and vibration, exactly the kind of failure a proper predictive maintenance schedule would have caught 2 weeks earlier. Before the budget cut eliminated the extra hands that used to do those inspections. He fixed it in 90 minutes. The mill was back online by end of shift. Nobody thanked him publicly. The plant manager, a decent, tired man named Ron Alvarez, thanked him privately, the way he always did, with a nod and a, "You saved us again," Marcus said, quietly enough that it wouldn't travel to the wrong ears. Vanessa Cole heard about the incident secondhand, filtered through Pine, Trent, who framed it as a minor issue quickly resolved. 2. No real cost to the business. What she did not hear was that the near miss had been a direct consequence of her own decision. What she heard instead was that her cost-cutting hadn't caused a disaster, which she took as validation. This was the first anomaly Marcus noticed that mattered beyond the usual mechanical failures. The gap between what was actually happening on his floor and what was being reported 2 floors up. He mentioned it to his friend, Denise Okafor, the quality assurance lead, over coffee in the break room the next morning. "They're going to keep cutting until something breaks that I can't fix in 90 minutes, he said. Denise had been at Callahan almost as long as he had. She had a master's degree in industrial engineering and had turned down 2 job offers elsewhere because she believed, stubbornly, in fixing things rather than leaving them broken. She trusted Marcus's instincts the way she trusted her own calibrated instruments. "Write it up," she said. "Get it on paper. Every time you catch something, document it. Dates, times, what it would have cost if you hadn't." He did not love paperwork, but he started keeping a log in a black composition notebook he kept in his toolbox, next to the wrenches. Over the following weeks, that notebook filled with small, precise entries: a hydraulic press, losing pressure, a conveyor motor overheating due to a bearing nobody had greased on schedule, because the schedule itself had been quietly stretched to save money. Each entry was a data point in a pattern that Marcus could see clearly and that the people above him refused to look at. He raised it through the proper channels 3 separate times. Once to Ron, who agreed but had no authority over budget. Once in a written memo to Trent, who never responded. Once, finally, in a scheduled meeting with Vanessa herself, the first and only time they spoke directly before everything came apart. She kept him waiting 20 minutes past the scheduled time, then gave him 11 minutes of her attention, checking her phone twice. "The maintenance interruptions are increasing," Marcus told her, sliding a single printed page across her desk, a summary of the notebook, dates and costs, no editorializing. "We're one failure away from something that costs more than the entire cut Saved. She skimmed it for maybe 10 seconds. Mr. Webb, I appreciate the initiative, she said in the tone people use when they do not appreciate anything. But I have engineers who model this. If there were a real risk, they'd have flagged it. They don't walk the floor, he said. I do. That's your job. Modeling risk is theirs. Let's keep everyone in their lane. He did not push further, not because he agreed, but because he understood something she did not. Arguing with someone who has already decided you are beneath the conversation is a door that will not open no matter how hard you knock. He thanked her for her time and left the report on her desk. She threw it away before he'd cleared the doorway. He heard the soft sound of it landing in the wastebasket and did not turn around. That night at home, he sat at the kitchen table, while Emma did her homework across from him, and he did not mention any of it. She noticed anyway. "Bad day?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "Just a long one. You get that face when work's dumb." "What face?" "The one you're doing right now." He laughed, once, and the tension in his shoulders loosened slightly, the way it always did around her. She had a way of putting things back into proportion without meaning to. The plant, meanwhile, kept accumulating small failures the way a hull accumulates barnacles. Nothing catastrophic on its own, everything corrosive over time. Vanessa's due diligence timeline moved forward. Investors were scheduled to visit in 10 weeks. Trent was busy assembling a presentation deck full of graphs that showed rising efficiency and falling costs. Numbers that were technically accurate and completely misleading because they compared this quarter's maintenance spend to last year's, without mentioning that the difference in spend was the difference between prevention and crisis response. That was Denise, who found the discrepancy that mattered. She was cross-referencing quality control rejects against maintenance logs for an unrelated audit, and she noticed that defect rates on the 5-axis mill line had crept upward by almost 4% over 8 weeks. Trend that should have triggered an automatic review under the company's own quality management protocol. It hadn't triggered anything because the person responsible for signing off on that protocol's monthly compliance report was Trent Buford, and Trent had been signing the reports without actually reviewing the underlying data. He delegated the review to a junior analyst who didn't understand what she was looking at and trusted the historical baseline numbers Trent had given her. Numbers that were 2 years out of date. Denise brought this to Marcus first, because that was simply how their working relationship functioned. Two competent people who trusted each other's judgment before they trusted the org chart. "This isn't just sloppy," she told him, spreading 2 printouts across his workbench. "This is somebody not looking on purpose." Marcus studied the numbers the way he studied a failing machine, slowly, without assumption, letting the pattern reveal itself instead of forcing a conclusion onto it. "If the defect rate keeps climbing at this slope," he said, "we're going to fail incoming inspection on the Bramwell Aerospace contract inside of a month. That's 40% of our aerospace revenue." "Does Vanessa know?" "She knows what Trent tells her." Denise looked at him for a long moment. "You should write this one up formally." Not the notebook. An actual incident report routed through corporate quality channels, not through Trent. He did. It took him 2 nights after Emma went to bed, sitting at his kitchen table with a black notebook open beside his laptop, translating 14 years of instinct into language a corporate compliance system could process. Root cause analysis, projected cost of failure, recommended corrective action. He submitted it through the formal channel Callahan had on paper, but which almost nobody used, because in practice everything got routed through operations first, which meant it landed on Trent's desk within the hour. Trent read it standing up, in the hallway outside his office, and his expression did not change, which was itself a kind of answer. He walked into Vanessa's office without knocking. "We've got a problem," he said. "Webb went around me, filed a formal quality incident, tried to make it look like I've been sitting on defect data. This was in its particulars exactly true, and Trent said it as though it were an outrage, rather than a description of what had actually happened." Vanessa did not read the report herself. She read Trent's summary of the report, which characterized Marcus's findings as unsubstantiated, his methodology as unqualified, and his motivation as insubordinate, possibly retaliatory, following his complaint about the maintenance budget. This was the moment the frame began to form, though nobody but Trent would have called it that. To him, it was simply management. A technician had made him look bad in front of the person who signed his bonus. That needed correcting. Trent spent the better part of 2 days building a counter-narrative. He pulled Marcus's timesheets and highlighted 2 occasions where Marcus had clocked slightly early departures. Both times because he'd left to pick up Emma from an after-school program that had closed unexpectedly. Both times covered by Ron's verbal approval. Dee neither documented in writing because nobody had ever needed to document it before. He characterized these as a pattern of unauthorized absence. He pulled a maintenance log entry where Marcus had written a blunt assessment of a supervisor's poor scheduling decision and called it insubordinate documentation. He assembled all of it into a single file, and he took that file to Vanessa, framed as a pattern of behavior, not 2 isolated administrative footnotes, but a concerning trajectory. Vanessa should have asked to see the original documents. She should have asked Ron, who would have vouched for Marcus in a heartbeat. She did neither because she had already decided somewhere beneath conscious thought that a maintenance technician who filed reports over his director's head and made appointments to lecture her about risk modeling was a problem to be managed rather than a source of information to be trusted. This is, in the end, the actual shape of the rot inside Callahan Manufacturing. It was not one villain doing one large evil thing. It was a hierarchy that had quietly decided whose voice counted before a single fact was ever weighed. The confrontation on the floor, the one that opened this story, happened on a Tuesday morning when Vanessa decided to walk the plant floor for the first time in 6 weeks. Largely because Trent had suggested it would look good. Ahead of the investor visit, a CEO who knows her people photographed near the machines for the eventual acquisition deck. She arrived with Trent at her side and found Marcus in the middle of exactly the kind of unglamorous, essential work that had kept the plant running for years. Elbow deep in the housing of the 5-axis mill, the same one that had gone down weeks earlier, performing the preventive teardown that should have been standard procedure all along, that he had scheduled himself without being asked, because nobody else had. Trent saw an opportunity and did not waste it. "This is Webb," he said to Vanessa, loudly enough for nearby workers to hear. "The one who filed the report." Vanessa looked at Marcus the way a person looks at an obstacle rather than a person. "You're the one who's been going over Trent's head," she said. It wasn't a question. "I filed a report through the formal channel," Marcus said, wiping his hands on a rag, not raising his voice. "That's not going over anyone. That's the channel. The channel exists, so operations can triage issues before they reach my desk with somebody's personal agenda attached. There's no agenda in the numbers. There's an agenda in choosing to bypass your director and imply he's covering up a safety issue. I didn't imply anything. I documented a defect trend. What Trent did with the compliance report is Trent's business. It was a fair statement, calmly delivered, and it should have ended the conversation in his favor, because it was true, and because he had the paperwork to prove it. Instead, it did the opposite, because Vanessa heard it as defiance rather than fact, and defiance in front of a factory floor full of employees was, to her, an unacceptable optic. "You fix machines," she said, and her voice climbed just enough to carry. "You don't audit my directors, you don't run risk assessments, you don't decide what goes on my desk. Know your place, Marcus." The floor went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when everyone present understands they've just watched someone cross a line they can't uncross. "You don't run this company," she said. "Understood." It was here that Marcus set down his wrench and picked it back up and closed his toolbox and walked out, and none of it happened the way an argument happens. It happened the way a decision happens, quiet, complete, and without any interest in being reversed. Ron found him in the parking lot toolbox, already in the truck bed. "Marcus, wait. Content. Mark." "She didn't mean. She meant it exactly," Marcus said. "That's the thing, Ron. She said exactly what she meant. The plant needs you." "I know." He said it without any bitterness at all, just as a fact, the same tone he used to describe a worn bearing. "That's not my problem to solve anymore." He drove home. He picked Emma up from school on time, for the first time in longer than he could remember, and she noticed immediately. "You're early." "I quit my job." She considered this with the seriousness of an 8-year-old processing large information. "Are we going to be okay?" "We're going to be fine." And because he believed it, she believed it too. What Marcus did not fully anticipate, because he was not a man who thought in terms of leverage, was exactly how fast the plant would come apart without him. Within 4 hours of his departure, the 5-axis mill he'd been mid-repair on threw its error code again, this time worse, cascading into an emergency shutdown that took the entire line down with it. The 2 remaining technicians spent 6 hours trying to diagnose a fault Marcus would have identified in 10 minutes because they did not have his ear for it and the manuals didn't cover what 14 years of listening had taught him. Within 2 days, 3 other machines developed issues that had clearly been building for weeks. Hairline problems nobody had caught because nobody had been walking the floor the way Marcus had walked it, quietly, constantly, without being told to. Within 5 days, Bramwell Aerospace's quality team flagged a batch of components for dimensional inconsistency, exactly the defect trend Marcus had documented, and Trent had buried. And the Bramwell contract, worth $22 million annually, went into formal review with a 30-day cure period attached, a polite corporate way of saying, "Fix this, or we leave." Within 8 days, 2 smaller clients, spooked by rumors traveling through the supplier network the way rumors always do, quietly canceled standing orders and moved them to a competitor. The board of Callahan Manufacturing, which had been largely hands-off under the assumption that Vanessa's operational competence matched her polish, began asking questions that Vanessa did not have good answers for. The chairman of that board was a man named Walter Pruitt, 71 years old, who had worked the Callahan floor himself as a young machinist 50 years earlier before working his way into ownership, back when the company was still called Callahan & Sons and actually had sons running it. He had stepped back from daily operations, but kept his board seat specifically because he did not trust private equity's instinct to hollow a company out for a quick sale. Walter drove to the plant himself on the 9th day, without calling ahead, which was something he still did occasionally, much to the irritation of whoever happened to be running things at the time. He walked the floor and found chaos dressed up as normal operation, machines running slower than they should, a palpable tension among the workers. Ron Alvarez looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in a week. "Where's Webb?" Walter asked him, because Walter had known Marcus for years, had shaken his hand at company picnics, had once watched him diagnose a problem with the original founder's old lathe, just by listening to it run a machine that predated Vanessa Cole's entire career by decades. Ron told him everything. The budget cut, the buried defect report, the confrontation on the floor. He did not editorialize. He simply laid it out the way Marcus would have laid it out in facts, in order, and let Walter draw his own conclusions. Walter listened without interrupting, and when Ron finished, he asked one question. "Do you have Webb's incident report?" The original one, before Trent got his hands on it? Ron did. He had made a copy for himself weeks earlier, an old habit from a career built on the belief that paper trails protect honest people. Walter read it twice. Standing in Ron's cramped office, the second read slower than the first. The way a man reads something when the first pass has already told him it's going to change what happens next. Then he asked for Vanessa. The meeting between Walter Pruitt and Vanessa Cole did not go the way Vanessa expected, because Vanessa still believed, even at that point, that this was a story about a difficult employee overstepping his role. "The Bramwell situation is being handled," she told him, sliding her own summary across the desk, full of phrases like corrective action plan and stakeholder alignment. Phrases that meant almost nothing and were designed to mean almost nothing. Walter set Ron's copy of Marcus's original report on the desk beside hers. "This was filed 6 weeks before Bramwell flagged anything," he said. "It identifies the exact defect trend on the exact line with a projected timeline that matches almost to the week. Who wrote this?" "The technician I mentioned, Marcus Webb. It's an unqualified assessment. It's dated 6 weeks ago. Vanessa Bramwell caught it on schedule. He predicted the failure before it happened, and somebody buried it. Trent reviewed it and determined. Trent signed compliance reports on data he never looked at. I had our outside auditor pull the digital timestamps this morning after Ron called me. Trent's review of the underlying quality data took him 90 seconds according to the system logs. 90 seconds for a monthly compliance sign-off. You can't read a grocery list in 90 seconds. Vanessa did not have an answer for that, not because she was speechless in some dramatic sense, but because the ground beneath her narrative had genuinely disappeared, and she was, for the first time in this story, forced to actually look at the facts instead of managing the appearance of them. "Where is Webb now?" Walter asked. "He resigned 9 days ago." "You mean he quit, or you mean you told the man with 14 years of irreplaceable knowledge that he didn't know his place in front of his coworkers, and he had the good sense to leave before you could do worse." He did not raise his voice either. He did not need to. Some sentences landed any volume. "I want him back in this building," Walter said, "not as a technician, as the person running it." Vanessa's expression did the thing expressions do when a person is calculating rapidly and trying not to show the calculation. "The board hasn't discussed. I'm discussing it now. I'm calling an emergency session for tomorrow morning. You'll want to be there." It was not a suggestion. Walter drove to Marcus's house that evening, unannounced, the same way he'd walked the plant floor unannounced, because he was a man who preferred to see things directly, rather than through the filter of someone else's account. He found the house exactly as you'd expect, modest, orderly. A bike, leaning against a porch rail, a basketball hoop over the garage with a net gone soft with age, but still hanging straight. Emma answered the door first, looked up at the stranger, and called over her shoulder, "Dad, there's an old guy here," which made Walter laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. Marcus came to the door in a T-shirt with grease still faintly staining one forearm from some project in the garage. He recognized Walter immediately, though they'd only spoken a handful of times over the years. "Mr. Pruitt, Marcus, can I come in?" "Won't take long." Marcus stepped aside, and Walter noticed, the way he noticed most things, the pegboard in the garage, visible through the open door, the outlines of tools, traced in marker, everything exactly where it belonged, and thought that a man who kept his tools like that probably kept his word the same way. They sat at the kitchen table. Emma disappeared upstairs, after a look from her father that she clearly understood as grown-up conversation, though she left the door at the top of the stairs open a few inches, the way kids do when they're pretending not to listen. "I read your report," Walter said. "Both versions, yours and what Trent did to it. It wasn't complicated." "No, it wasn't. That's what makes it worse." He explained what he'd found, the fabricated pattern of insubordination, the buried compliance failure, the falsified review timestamps, the Bramwell contract now hanging by a thread that Marcus had tried to reinforce 6 weeks before anyone else even noticed it was fraying. The way he listened to a machine before diagnosing it, letting the whole pattern surface before he responded to any single piece of it. "The plant's in trouble," Walter said. "Real trouble. 3 lines are running below capacity. Bramwell's in a 30-day cure period, and I've got a board that's starting to panic. I want you to run it." Marcus did not answer immediately. This, too, was consistent with everything Walter had already observed about him. He did not rush toward conclusions, mechanical or otherwise. "Run it how?" "CEO. Full authority. Cole's out. The board's meeting tomorrow morning, and, after what I found today, that outcome isn't in question anymore. I've never run a company. You've been running the parts of this company that actually matter for over a decade. Nobody paid attention because nobody had to. That's not the same as not knowing how." Marcus turned his coffee mug a quarter turn on the table, an old habit, something to do with his hands, while his mind worked through a problem the way it worked through a failing bearing. "I'll take it," he said. "On one condition." "Name it." "Vanessa Cole apologizes. On the floor, in front of the same people who heard her tell me to know my place. Not in a memo, not in a settlement letter. In person, out loud, where everyone who watched it happen can watch this happen too." Walter studied him for a moment, and something in his face suggested he had expected a different demand entirely: equity, a bigger title, a signing bonus, the ordinary currency of corporate negotiation, and found himself, instead, sitting across from a man who wanted exactly one thing, and it wasn't money. That's it. That's your condition? That's it. Most men in your position would ask for a great deal more. Most men in my position weren't in that room. I don't need her fired for my sake. The board can decide that on the merits. I need the people who work that floor to see with their own eyes that what happened to me was wrong and that it got corrected. That's not for me. That's for the next person. She would have done it too. Walter nodded slowly, and for the first time in the conversation, something like respect settled visibly into his expression. Not the practiced respect of a man closing a business deal, but something closer to recognition. Done, he said. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. The emergency board meeting the next morning lasted 40 minutes, and Vanessa Cole spent most of it learning, in real time, exactly how much damage had accumulated on her watch while she was building a deck of graphs for investors who would now, thanks to the Bramwell situation, likely never see it. Trent Buford's falsified compliance timestamps were the piece nobody could argue around. Digital records don't have opinions. Trent tried briefly to characterize it as an oversight, a matter of workload, and the board's outside counsel asked him a single question. Did you review the underlying defect data before signing the compliance certification? Yes or no, that he could not answer honestly without admitting fraud and could not answer dishonestly without contradicting the system logs already in front of the board. He was terminated before lunch. Security walked him out through the same doors Marcus had walked out of 9 days earlier, though nobody in that building felt the same way, watching it happen. Vanessa's termination took slightly longer, mostly because there were severance and legal considerations the board needed to work through. But the outcome was never genuinely in doubt once Walter laid the full picture in front of them. A maintenance budget cut, made without walking the floor, a documented risk ignored, a whistleblower punished publicly for being right, and a director's fraud that she'd taken at face value because it was convenient and flattering to her own narrative. She was, however, still technically CEO for 11 more days, a strange administrative limbo the board created deliberately, at Walter's specific request, so that one particular piece of business could be completed before her formal exit. The apology on the floor that Marcus had asked for as his only condition. It happened on a Thursday morning. At the start of first shift, with as many of the 600 plant employees gathered as the floor could hold without stopping every line completely. Marcus stood near the same 5-axis mill where the original confrontation had happened, not out of theater, but because Ron had suggested it and Marcus had seen no reason to argue with the symmetry. Vanessa Cole walked out onto the floor in the same kind of tailored blazer she'd worn 11 days earlier, though something in the way she carried herself had changed, the posture of a person who has spent several sleepless nights being forced to actually see herself. She did not have notes. Walter had offered to help her write something, and she had declined, which was, in its own way, the first honest decision she'd made in front of that floor since arriving at Callahan. 11 days ago, she said, and her voice did not carry the same confidence it had carried before. I stood on this floor and told Marcus Webb to know his place. I was wrong. I was wrong about what his place was, and I was wrong about what mine was. She paused, and the pause went on long enough that a few people in the crowd exchanged glances, unused to watching someone in her position struggle for words rather than perform them. He identified a defect trend 6 weeks before it cost us a $22 million contract. I didn't read his report. I let someone else's summary of it decide what I thought, because it was easier than doing the work myself. When he tried to warn me directly, I told him to stay in his lane, because I'd already decided before he ever opened his mouth that his lane didn't include being right about something that mattered. She looked at Marcus directly then, not at the crowd, not at Walter, standing off to one side, just at him. I'm sorry. Not because the board is making me stand here, because it was true and I said it anyway in front of people who look up to you, and I meant to make you smaller in front of them. That was cruel. And it was also stupid, because you were the only person in this building who actually understood what was happening to it. Marcus did not say anything for a moment. The floor waited. Apology accepted, he said finally, simply, with no flourish attached to it because he had never needed flourish for anything in his life. That's all I asked for. It was, by any dramatic standard, an anticlimactic exchange, and that was exactly the point. He had not wanted a scene. He had wanted the truth said out loud where the people who'd heard the lie could hear the correction too. Water closing back over the stone that had been thrown into it. Vanessa left the building 20 minutes later, for the last time. Nobody escorted her out. She did not need to be escorted. She walked out on her own, which Walter later said was the only genuinely dignified thing he'd watched her do in the 3 months she'd run the company. Marcus was named CEO of Callahan Manufacturing the following Monday, and he did not change the culture of the building through any single dramatic gesture. He changed it the way he fixed machines, methodically, one worn part at a time. He reinstated the full maintenance budget within his first week and added, on Denise's recommendation, a formal predictive maintenance program that gave weight to floor-level observation, not just software modeling. He personally called the Bramwell Aerospace quality director, walked him through the corrective action plan line by line, and got the cure period extended because the man on the other end of the phone could tell, within 5 minutes, that he was talking to someone who actually understood the failure, rather than someone reciting a script written by a communications team. He promoted Ron to a newly created role overseeing plant operations across 2 facilities, work Ron had been quietly doing the real substance of for years without the title. He gave Denise a formal seat on the executive team, the first quality lead in company history to have one, because he believed, correctly, that a company that didn't listen to the people who caught its mistakes was a company setting up its own next crisis. He kept his commute the same. He still made 2 lunches every morning, apple slices included, and Emma still checked his lunch bag before he left. Though now, she added, with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old, "You're the boss now, you know. You could just buy lunch. I like making it. You like being cheap. That too." Walter Pruitt stayed on the board, and something like a friendship developed between him and Marcus that neither man would have called a friendship out loud, though it showed itself in small ways, Walter stopping by the plant on no particular schedule, the 2 of them walking the floor together, Walter asking questions and actually waiting for the full answer instead of the summary. 6 months later, at the company's annual dinner, held that year at the plant itself instead of a rented banquet hall, because Marcus had insisted the people who built the products should be able to attend without needing a babysitter or a bus ticket, Walter found himself standing near the same 5-axis mill, watching Marcus talk with a cluster of line workers about a proposed change to the second shift schedule, listening more than talking, the way he always did. "You know," Walter said. When Marcus finally drifted over with 2 cups of coffee, handing one to him, Vanessa Cole had every advantage this company could offer her. Money, title, board support at the start, a clean slate. And she lost it all in 10 weeks because she couldn't be bothered to walk the floor and listen to the people already on it. She wasn't the problem, Marcus said, after a moment. The problem was a system that let somebody run a plant for 3 months without ever having to actually look at it. And you'd have caught that, eventually, even without the confrontation. Probably. Wouldn't have made as good a story, though. Walter laughed. Actually laughed. Something Marcus had learned over the months was rarer than it should have been for a man who'd spent 50 years around this industry. "Emma, still checking your lunch?" "Every morning. Apple slices, non-negotiable." Smart kid. She usually is. Later that evening, after most of the tables had cleared and the plant had gone quiet in the particular way it went quiet after hours, machines resting instead of running, Marcus walked the floor alone one last time before heading home. The way he used to, when he was the only one who ever really looked. Nothing needed fixing that night. Every machine was exactly where it should be, running exactly the way it was supposed to run, which was, in its own understated way, the entire point of everything that had happened. He picked up his toolbox from the workbench near the door, the same one he'd carried out through those doors months earlier, latch clicking twice the way it always did, and drove home to his daughter, to a kitchen table with a calendar on the refrigerator, to a life that had never actually needed a title to be worth living well. The plant kept running. The contracts held. And somewhere in that quiet, orderly consistency was the only vindication Marcus Webb had ever really wanted. Not the office, not the title, just the simple, uncontested fact that the work had always spoken for itself. And now, finally, everyone was listening,